Let's see, it is the October 10th work session for City of Oregon City. Roll call, please.
Commissioner Ide?
Here.
Commissioner O'Donnell?
Here.
Commissioner Mengelberg? Here. President Shaw?
Here.
And Mayor Holliday is absent at this time, but should be attending a little bit later.
Thank you. So, we're going to move right into discussion items. 3A, Oregon City Transportation System Development Charge Analysis and Municipal Code. That'll be John Lewis, please.
Thank you, Commissioner Shaw and Commission. So tonight we wanted to talk to you about transportation SDCs. I would say this discussion is a positive discussion, but it's a challenging discussion because we're talking about fees. And so recognizing that, it's a fairly lengthy presentation. We've had a couple of SDC educational opportunities through the SDC Forum and through the SDC Roundtable that we held in 2017. First one we held in 2015, the other one we held in 2017. And really, it's a conversation worth discussing because it has impacts to the community, definitely for the new, our new or future development in our community. So I think it's easy to put this conversation off. Besides inflationary increases to SDCs, having a conversation with the commission or the community about raising SDCs is always a challenge for us. So we don't take that lightly. I guess the other challenge for me is every day I have a conversation with somebody in this community about the need for different transportation improvements. It's the hottest topic that we deal with. And at the same time, there's the flip side of that conversation, which is, hey, we really don't think we should have to pay much for that. Can we pay less for that but get more? So we have that conversation pretty regularly. I'd like to introduce Dana Webb, who's the city staff, and Doug Gabbard with FCS Group. They're going to come up. You just want to sit up the front here, and in case needed, they're going to help me out. We want to get through this pretty quickly, so we're not divvying it up too much, but Dana put a lot of work into the data that I'm presenting, and Doug has he's with FCS Group, so he knows a lot of the details behind our SDCs. So with that, I'll go ahead and get into the presentation. So we've got quite a few slides here, and what I'd really like to do is ask your permission to speed right through a lot of the background slides. This is a topic that we've talked about a lot. But obviously there's community members that don't necessarily have a good handle on SDCs. Some of you I may be overestimating how much familiarity you have with SDCs. So we don't have to skip through those. There's a lot of information in this presentation. We're gonna have all this information available online as well. But my thought was try to get through those in abbreviated version, also the regional comparison slides, and then get down to the meat of the project, which is about our project list and some of the methodology considerations that we had on SDCs. So we'll start fast, and if you guys have questions, you can interrupt, and we'll slow down if need be, but that's my hope. I'm also giving you a real quick preview just because this kind of gets to the bottom line really quickly. And we're gonna come back to this slide to explain it to you, but really you'll see these three scenario comparisons: a single family residential, specialty retail of 2,000 square foot, and general office of 10,000 square foot. Those are kind of industry standard comparison types of development. The middle column is the 2017. If somebody walked in the door today and had this kind of development, they would pay an SDC total, like what you see under single family residential, of $8,841.10. That would be the transportation element of our SDCs. And if we look at kind of the full brunt of what the project list and some of what we're bringing tonight is for a single family residential, that full brunt would go up to $9,902. So some increases. I would say not out of the unusual, but they're increases. And I think that's what we're asking you to consider. These are the kind of numbers we're going to be bringing back to you in an actual meeting and we have to go through public hearings, a couple of public hearings to get there, and we'll give you a schedule on when we're proposing that. But this is kind of on the upper end of what we're proposing. So this will come back again.
Mr. Lewis, if I could interrupt, I see the focus is on bike and pedestrian traffic.
That's right. So
The other fees go down, but those go up significantly?
right.
Okay.
Yep. Good observation. So we just have a lot of history with transportation STCs, about 25 years of history. And in 2009, we hired the FCS group. Doug wasn't with them at that time, but we hired the FCS group to develop our methodology. And they looked at our transportation system plan and our capital project list, and they put together our resolution 902, and we've kind of been working off that ever since. We did do a TSP update in 2013, and here we are in 2017. We're really kind of talking about adopting that list and adopting fees associated with that. So just real quick, this is kind of SDC 101. In its simplest form, you take our needs, our project list, and you divide that by our projected growth, and that results in our unit rate for SDCs. Okay, so there's a reimbursement and improvement component to that. Reimbursement is kind of a look back. Improvement is a look forward. But while SDCs are one of our more complicated things to talk about, this is it in its simplest form. Okay, so think about numerator and denominator, because our project list and our cost of our project list is our numerator, and then the amount of peak trips that we anticipate into the future is our denominator. Just to give you some rate history, it's a lot of information, but back in 2009, we were about $7,200 in transportation SDCs. We're currently up to almost $9,000 in SDC for 2017. So that includes both the vehicle and the bike ped. What you can see in here is that these rates are our base rate. There's a multiplier for every kind of development, including residential. So there's a small multiplier. So if you look at our residential rates, it's a little bit higher than what's shown here. But this is the base rate that we use in our calculations. Not sure how much of this you want. We've got a lot of details about revenues and expenditures on SDCs. What I really wanted to talk about was that we do track those in great detail and can share with you at length all the projects that we've funded over the past. Really the key point that I thought would be important for you tonight is that we currently have about $9,276,313 worth of SDCs. And that's in the bank right now. Seems like a pretty big number, especially when you compare that to the fund balances of the past. We've been saving that for good reason, and I'll talk about that in this slide. So that balance goes pretty quickly when you start thinking about some of the things that this community has asked us to do and wants us to do. So the Myers Road extension, we've budgeted $4.6 million to complete the Myers Road project. That's not the extent of the project, but that's the amount of SDCs that are going into that project. Malala Avenue, our contribution for our share of that grant project is $2 million in SDCs, and we've matched that with another $2 million from pavement maintenance fee, and I think we got about $4 million out of that from the grant. So it's an $8 million project, and $2 million of that comes from SDCs. Also, we'll pay a portion of the 12th and Washington signal using SDCs. You've heard a lot about alternate mobility targets. That study work is paid using SDCs. Any kind of corridor concept planning that adds more capacity we're covering. 99E and some of the work around the Willamette Falls project, that's in there. And one of my favorite projects, the Warner Milne Roundabout project, is also likely to get some SDC funding for it. So We want to talk a little bit about SDC comparisons. This is always information that people are interested in. So we're bringing what we know today. There's a couple of anomalies in here that I want to point out. We haven't fully been able to confirm. Lake Oswego adopted a transportation SDC rate recently, and it would take them to the highest in the region at $14,760 per for their base rate, and we're down there at $8,841 for our base rate. So they have struggled with that, from what we understand, and it's back to the commission for their consideration. And that number is very likely to come down from where they set it. I heard from Doug that also Sherwood, theirs has increased about $100. Wilsonville's has increased about $4,000. So these slides haven't been updated to reflect those numbers. And there we are. This is a single-family chart that shows kind of how we compare on a transportation system development charge level. This compares all our SDCs. So again, on the single-family rate side, Oregon City's in about the middle of the pack, and there's definitely others that are above and below us. Want to do a shout out for Phil, my brother Phil over there at Parks SDCs. You know, I think when I look at those, it seems like, you know, we're not the lowest when it comes to park SDCs, but there's definitely some folks who seem to have either greater needs or more value on parks. I'm not sure which you could say, but I think that's an important one to figure out or to share. The other thing I'll point out about this slide is in Washington County, they have a transportation development tax, and that's a Washington County charge that that all cities adopt and have to collect. Cities have the option of also, on top of that, collecting their own SDC. So as you can see from the colored chart, Tigard, for instance, well, North Bethany, there's a few others in there that have their own SDC on top of the Washington County Transportation Development Tax. So this is for single family comparison. What I meant to mention in my early slide is on the commercial side of things, this again is a graph representing that specialty retail at 2,000 square feet. So we're using that same scenario. Again, Oregon City on the commercial side of things is typically on the high end of the scale. Not as high as Lake Oswego, but again, I think that number is likely to change to some degree. I still think they're going to be high, but it's probably not going to be where it's at shown in this graph. And then looking at a different type of development, again, we're up there with Lake Oswego and Wilsonville and Banks. North Bethany has, they've got some special needs out there, so theirs are still very high. Wilsonville, again, would be an additional $4,000 over and above this, or something close to that. Oops, sorry. So we have the 2009 work that we've been basically living off of, with the exception of, well, we live off that methodology. That's how we implement our SDCs. The rates that were set in 2009, we've been increasing those by inflation over the years. 2013, we created this Transportation System Plan update. We didn't actually adopt the Transportation System Plan project list. And updating the Transportation System Development Charge, we identified a list of projects we want, but we've not updated the rate to be able to collect the funds for those projects. So we're kind of in that middle ground where we need to update our list as well as update the TSP. Well, like we updated the TSP. By not updating the list, we've essentially created a discount because we probably should have updated those beyond what we've already done. And I guess the last thing is we're going to show you details. Actually, in your packet, there was a project list of several projects, over 200 projects in that list. and we're going to talk a little bit about that. We also tonight, we were trying to make last-minute map changes, provided maps that go along with that project list, so you can not only see the list, you can find the project on them. There's 6 different maps that they show up on, so making headway with that. So we rolled up all the city's transportation project estimate information into this spreadsheet. And this is, should be exactly the same totals that you would get out of your, out of that project list that we included in your packet. Just to explain this spreadsheet again, we've got, again, a breakout between vehicles and pedestrian and bike projects. We've got our 2009 adopted project list, and those project numbers go along with that 2009 list. And then the 2018, which is got a different set of projects to some degree. For the most part, the vehicle projects stay very similar. We've deleted some and added some, which we'll show you. The vehicle project total has, we've done some estimate changes that we'll share with you, but for the most part, there's about a $50 million difference there. And it's my understanding that the major component of that difference was the Beaver Creek 213 project, which was a elevated separate, how do we call it? Grade separated interchange project, right? So there was an idea that we'd have some kind of flyover interchange at that location. That project has been removed from the list, determined to not be practical. I guess the other piece to that was most of that project would have been funded by ODOT. ODOT has told us we're not funding that project. And interestingly enough, none of that project was considered having any element of SDC funding to it back in 2009. So that's kind of an interesting piece that I wanted to point out. As has been pointed out, the bike and pedestrian component is a different story. So in 2009, we had 96 projects. In 2018, we have 274 projects, 274 projects. So, and the project value for those has gone up because there's more projects. And so we, right now there's an increase of $37.5 million. We added about 180 projects. And I would say, while those numbers seem big, the amount of community feedback that we got about the importance of these pedestrian and bicycle projects was significant when we went through the transportation system plan adoption process. And actually some other projects or other concept plans that have been adopted since the TSP. So a lot of public involvement, a lot of buy-in to those projects. Amending that project list, while it sounds tempting, I think is a bit problematic for the city if we were to do that. We'd probably have to go back through some land use process to really kind of take on significant change with those. So again, just showing some project totals here. Just keep in mind, we're recognizing that bike and pedestrian number, that $43,960,944, that number has taken our bike ped SDC from $200 in 2009 to just over $1,500 as proposed, okay? So that's something to talk about. I just think we're trying to show you the details here. So these are some of the projects that we added. You may be familiar with the South End Concept Plan, the Lynn Avenue, Leland Road, Myers Road Corridor Plan, the Lima Falls Legacy Project, Myers Road. All these had projects that we've amended to the to the proposed project list. And then just wanting to reemphasize that overall the consensus from the community feedback, maintain the project list. So this is an option that we have, is to go ahead and maintain our project list. It gives us lots of flexibility. We may not choose to collect all the money for that, but if we keep those projects on the list, it gives us the opportunity to marry up our funding with, say, a development project that makes sense, that they're not necessarily obligated to build, but it makes sense to build, or a grant project, any funded project that the city is pursuing. It gives us the opportunity to have a longer list of projects to choose from. So we're advocating for, we agree with the community, and we're advocating to, whatever we do, let's keep that list. Let's not try and scratch projects off that list. Okay, the project list itself, the one that was included in the 2018 project list. I think we provided both the 2009 and the 2018 project list in your packet, but the 2018 project list, we hired DKS and Associates. Actually, Dana worked with them to look at the project list and make sure all the unit costs associated with that were updated from what they originally included in 2013. We also asked them to look closely at their split and revalidate. We saw some things that we thought were a little off on the growth share versus non-growth share. So we've asked them to validate that, and growth share means if it's a growth share, it's that component of the overall project cost is SDC eligible. If it's not growth, if it's a non-growth cost share, then that would have to be paid in another way. Gas taxes, pavement maintenance fees, taxes, some other way, grant, all those kind of things. So we put a lot of energy into that. I guess the other thing I'll say is typically those non-growth cost share kinds of projects are really because they're serving, they usually align with projects that or streets that are already in existence that just need to be bigger. So the growth cost share would be for adding additional lanes. Other projects like safety projects might not necessarily qualify for SDCs unless they're providing some additional capacity. The other thing that I want to say about eligible projects, and I guess maybe I'll go back if I can to this number. So that that 43 million, so the bike pedestrian projects, so that number, that total $43,960,000 line item, that represents 39.4% of every bike ped project on the list. And that's a number based on projected growth and what our existing population is. So how many more let's say population. I think they looked at trips, not necessarily population, but they're similar in this case in that as we grow, that new growth is expected to pay for that much of it. But there's a lot of existing residents and existing businesses, existing population that is expected to pay for the balance of those projects because they benefit them as well, okay? There's a couple of, we basically have added, I think we're eliminating 3 projects that were on the list. Projects like the Dunes Drive extension that was planned and suggested should go through the Oregon City Shopping Center. That would have been only if the Cove hadn't developed the way the Cove is developing. So we've removed that project from the list. There's a couple other projects that we've removed from the list, and then we've added a couple of projects, one related to Willamette Falls and some of the commitments that we've made to the state to work on 99E. And then we've also added, and this is a question Commissioner Mengelberg you had, we added in a project for the Beaver Creek Road westbound right turn merge lane. So those projects have been added. Not all of that project is SDC eligible, but 48% of it is SDC eligible. So we've added that into the project list.
John, those are just added recently, or when did you do that?
When I say added, I say we've added them to this proposed 2018 list. So officially they're not added. They're up for consideration, but we've incorporated those into the project list because we think that project list is pretty solid and would like to get, we definitely like to get a head nod from you folks on that. As that's where we're proposing to bring back to you in public hearing would be definitely the project list. We need to get that adopted.
John, I have
Go
a
ahead, Nancy.
question.
Oh, go ahead.
In Oregon City, is there a requirement that the improvement that is made be funded by development kind of within a certain proximity, or is it all into one pot and it can be spent on anything on the list?
Yeah, SDCs go into one pot and we can spend them anywhere across the city. We don't have a special district, for instance. Some cities do, we don't. The North Bethany area, for instance, is kind of a special district of its own. We don't have that in Oregon City.
Thank you.
Okay, Nancy.
Are you going to be talking about the priorities, or is that the project number? Is that supposed to tell us something? Because I'm not sure what like D45 means. Does that mean that it's the 45th project on the list, or?
That's all that means. It's not priorities. In the TSP, we did have some priority lists that were, trying to remember how those went. Do you remember that, Dana? Was it likely to be funded? But short-term, mid-term, long-term is what I was thinking of. So there is some priorities, but what we're finding is internally we may have some priorities. You know, as staff picks projects, for instance, like Myers Road. I'm hearing about I got an email the other day about, now that you put Myers Road through, what about the other piece of Myers Road that's not wide enough, right? So I think there is some need as city staff and as a community to, you know, vet priorities. But for the most part, a lot of this stuff is somewhat developer driven, right? Or if it's not developer driven, it may be, you know, Eric's trying to work on Beaver Creek concept plan and make sure we're inspiring jobs out in those areas. So we might want to focus on those project areas first. The Beaver Creek concept area is probably kicked off more than, say, the South End concept area is likely to kick off. So how do we pick that? We do have the TSP as a guide, but we haven't had a lot of discussion around the project list and project priorities. All right, so Doug is going, I've tried explaining this to myself and I still stumble, so I've asked Doug to help me with.
Job security, Doug.
Yes,
Nice
sir.
going. Yeah.
Commissioners, for the record, I am Doug Gabbard with FCS Group. So what John wanted me to explain is kind of the different approaches to calculating an SDC. And I want you to think about a 2x2 matrix, where at the top you have peak trips and average trips as your two options. And on the rows, you have vehicle trips versus person trips. Person trips trying to capture more than just people in the vehicle, at least that's the idea. In your case, because you've already broken out bike ped and its own denominator versus your vehicle denominator, that really doesn't help you any. It doesn't get you any further, it doesn't get you anything more, and so that's not really relevant in your case. There can be an importance in the difference between peak trips versus average daily trips. It doesn't make much difference for residential properties, but for non-residential properties that do have a pronounced afternoon peak, or that definitely don't have a pronounced afternoon peak, that could really create some winners and losers on how big their SDC is. Example, if someone was going to build an office park that were pretty much 9 to 5 kinds of jobs, they would be very much hoping that you would adopt an average daily trip methodology, because they would get hammered on a peak trip. On the other end, a grocery store would kind of be rooting for the peak hour trip approach, because their customers come in all throughout the day, and an average daily trip would really capture a lot more. So for residential land uses, it doesn't make much of a difference. The winners and losers are really created on the commercial side. Did that capture kind of what you wanted explained?
That explains that. The only other thing I'll add to that is just kind of this slide touches on, you know, our methodologies are really founded in the Institute of Transportation Engineers trip generation data. So that's years of data that's collected nationally that we apply when we're looking at SDCs. And most of these trip numbers that you see in our methodology they all derive from that. You know, in our methodology, both the vehicle and bike ped have some form of development type or land use code associated with them. So that's what I like about our methodology. We also have a couple other little things that we do that I think helps our commercial folks with the mixed-use downtown corridor. They get a discount, which I think has been very helpful over the years for that area. And then we also look at the different square footages within different kinds of buildings, and I think the most recent example of that I can think of is like a brewery with a tasting room, for instance. They might have the tasting room be a small room where they allow that kind of use that feels a little bit more like a restaurant, but the rest of the shop is more like some kind of light industrial or manufacturing, which has a lower trip rate. So I think we have some, I think what we're bringing to you is really a recommendation to stay with our existing methodology. And I think that's the bottom line, is knowing that we looked at other methodologies. We did a lot of work both internal and with the FCS group to kind of project. We asked Laura, hey, what's the development going to look like in the next 5 years? And then we applied these different methodologies to see if there was something. And what it looked to me like, at the end of the day, all methodologies collect the same totals. Either one of these alternates mixes things up a bit and might make the grocery store owner happy, but not make the office, developer happy. It was kind of like creating a whole bunch of frustration for not a really good reason. So we're suggesting we stick with the peak hour vehicle trips, we think that a lot of agencies are going to these peak person trips because they don't have a bike ped SDC. They've incorporated into their one component, which is a total SDC, versus ours, which has got the breakout. And I think ours is a lot more realistic to what the number of vehicle trips is and the number of bike trips. Okay. Okay, so back to these bike trips. So we're recognizing a little bit of a liability between what we had before and what we're suggesting we should be collecting for now. We also have this, what seems to be a bit of an imbalance between new residential and new non-residential development, right? Doug talked a little bit about the commercial. This is the group that tends to get hit hardest with our SDCs because they've got bigger units, they have impacts, and we're already at the top end of the scale for commercial. We're not so much at the top end for new residential. So we're suggesting a couple of alternatives, and we're going to go through those. Just keep in mind that these alternatives, they use the same cost estimates. We're not playing with the numbers at all. None of these proposals will affect how the revenues are spent. In other words, we can still spend those on the qualifying projects. It will have an impact on residential versus commercial, and you'll see that. And bike ped allocation scenarios, yeah, we've got a variety of those, or just, 3 of those to show you. So we're going to go ahead and show that in, not this slide, but the upcoming slide. So this is that same slide that I showed you. I don't think I'll spend much more time on it. It just kind of shows the different breakout for the different scenarios. This is kind of one that's interesting, and we came up with a couple. So this is that same information. You see the 2017 information in the second column. You see the 2018 information in the third column. The fourth column is where we take a stab at trying to reallocate those project lists. And what we did here was we said everybody in the city should pay an SDC for the bike ped projects. This, I guess the other thing I want to back out before I jump into that is the vehicle. We're saying, if anything, our vehicle is going down, right? Based on our analysis, our vehicle SDC goes down. We're not breaking that out in any different way those numbers are going to be the same across all these scenarios, for all the scenarios and for all the different types of proposals for SDCs. So just keep in mind those numbers don't change. We're really looking pretty close at the bike and ped on this one. And so we are doing this in a way that allocates a portion of those bike and ped projects to the commercial, but also to the residential. So we're calling it a residential add-on. That's that kind of third row under single family, just so you are paying attention. Second and third row, really, you should pay attention to. So we've taken that project list that was used to develop the $1,504 bike ped SDC, and we've said if we take all those projects and we divide them by arterial and collector, and we say those projects should be paid for citywide. Citywide, everybody uses them, but those projects also bring, outsiders use those projects as well. So we're splitting those projects citywide, right? For any new development across the city, they would pay that. But we're taking the local streets and allocating those to the residential component of the SDC. And that has, a significant effect. I would take our current SDC for single-family residential from $8,841 to $10,596. But it has the effect that we think we are being asked to consider of it's just a slight increase over what we currently have for the commercial SDCs. So we think this is a good approach. This is actually my most preferred alternative. The next alternative takes the, again, it takes the, if I remember this one correctly, we basically take and we split all the bike ped trips and we split them equally, right? 50%. So we look at that $43 million number and we split that out, and then we divide it by the citywide and the residential ads. And so that becomes still an increase on the residential side. It helps on the retail side, but not nearly as much. So there's lots of scenarios here. I do think one thing that Doug said was, hey, this problem with that last column is that it's a little too arbitrary. And when you talk about just splitting out these SDC and these projects, the law prohibits you from being arbitrary. You need to somehow have a methodology to get there. And so that fourth column under the 2018 facility type, we know that does that because it's basically saying local streets should be paid for by local new development only.
John, question. Wouldn't a new residential developer need to provide sidewalks as part of the development? Aren't they already constructing that? And so are they being hit twice by also paying SDCs on top of that, or are they being credited for the sidewalks that they're constructing?
That's a good question. Usually the sidewalks within their development are not on our project list. So they have to build those projects. And if there is a project that's on our project list that they're conditioned to build through their land use conditions of approval, then it's called a qualifying public improvement project, and they can request reimbursement for that. It's got to be on the list. It's got to be a land use condition of approval.
Okay.
But once that happens, then they can ask for, I think we give credits for that instead of a check. We usually give them credits that they can use against those homes that they're building, and they're likely going to use it against that single-family home of rate of whatever that happens to be.
Okay, thank you.
So that's a good question. So I'm well over, but there's more to this topic, as you might imagine. We've heard from the chamber and other community members about several other things that they think we should be considering. So maintain the project list rather than reduce the list. We are holding on to that one because we think that's important. SDCs for redevelopment should be discounted. That's looking at some of the problems we've had with development that might be right down the street or in a neighborhood, property burnt down or got torn down. It's not been developed in a long time. They feel like we should be adding or providing better discounts for that. We've got some specific code language that we'd probably bring back to you. We think there's some give in that in those areas that could help with the chamber's concern about not valuing that old development that may have happened years ago. If they've asked about better bankrupting rates and consider buying down SDCs, and we see problems with both those, we can bring, again, more information back to you on that. We just felt like this presentation was getting too long, but bottom line is we're not the bank, and we've had a lot of defaults in the past on SDCs that we've bankrupted. And so Mr. Parno feels pretty strongly, and I agree with him, that bankrupt rates should stay at, right now the rate is 9%. Or they can go to the bank and get a loan that way to pay down their SDCs. The idea of buying down SDCs, it's a good question. How we would do that, what that source of money would be, given that we have a lot of that other part of the project, that's that non-growth part of the project. We're not quite sure how we're always going to cover that. So trying to find funding for buying down SDC rates, it's hard to say how we would do that. So haven't heard great ideas on that. This is back to consider SDC methodology that changes to more appropriately allocate qualifying projects to the residential community. That's kind of the split that we've been talking about. And I think the other piece is the city should assume alternate funding, grants, developer obligated funds, those kind of things like Commissioner Mingerberg, you brought up. Developers do pay their fair share. I think we have that in our SDC methodology that values, input like that. Obviously, if we get grants, it's going to reduce our need for SDCs, but I also see a large portion of our projects are in that non-growth share, so that grants are going to help us cover those kind of project needs. So here's where we think we're headed. We were hoping to get some level of discussion tonight that would help inform where we go from here, but we'd like to do a public hearing. Dana tells me we've got to go through public process, so we're going to get all over that and pursue that probably more in February or March, mostly because that requires some pretty lengthy notice, time limits, so that folks can have a chance to see what we're producing and preparing to present and have an opportunity to comment on that, either in written or in public testimony. So we've got those noticing requirements, and we'd like to adopt a new transportation CIP project list in March. That would be by resolution. We also have some of these other smaller changes we think we could bring back to you, sooner than that. They don't require the public noticing. So we'll have to make a determination whether we want to bring that all back as one package or if we want to piece that out. But there's probably some things that we could fix there pretty quickly and help some of that development out there, especially the commercial development or redevelopment that's waiting. 45 minutes, sorry, that's longer than I'd planned.
Okay.
I have a couple questions.
Sure.
One was, are the bike ped improvements primarily on arterials and collectors, or are we trying to tackle a deficit in residential areas or a safe route to school? How is it prioritized, the projects for bike and ped?
So back to the prioritization, I'd have to look at the TSP to see which ones were long, short, and medium term projects. I don't remember those. I would say our projects, just kind of studying the maps, and again, I don't know if you have them. We put them in the packet today, so you may not have seen them, but they're really spread all over the place. They're pretty well distributed across the city. And so I think there's both. I mean, a lot of our arterial and collectors have some form of pedestrian way. They may not have some form of bike way, but there's gaps, definitely gaps that we would need to fix.
A couple other questions. One is, I know that Laura Turway and her committee are going to be starting to look at accessory dwelling units, and how would those be considered under this new methodology?
So we haven't proposed any changes in this so far, but there is something to be said for the trip generation of an accessory dwelling unit. Maybe Doug, you can, I don't know if you're prepared to talk about that, but it's same as, so that's what you're thinking right now, same as multifamily. You want to express that?
So we do have accessory dwelling units allowed in the city today. In all places that allow single family, you get one accessory dwelling unit as well. And so the SDC rate, I believe, is the same as a multifamily rate, which is about half of a single family rate. But it is part of the equitable housing discussion of the costs of additional housing opportunities, and if we also want to allow additional ADUs on properties. For example, Portland allows two, one within a building and then one separate.
I guess I was thinking more in terms of, sometimes multifamily can be a 3-bedroom home, and accessory dwelling unit can be much smaller than that. We don't have provisions for that yet in our code, and we probably need to look at that. So that's a good point.
So tied to square footage, maybe, something like that.
I'll just throw in that it is true that dealing with it as multifamily is a typical way of dealing with ADUs, because it has come up in other places.
So in general, the rate would be less than a single family
Absolutely.
dwelling? Okay, because we want to, I mean, I believe from a policy direction, we would want to be incentivizing or encouraging ADUs, and so if we're now looking at SDCs, that would be on par or higher, then that's a disincentive.
Just to be clear, I want to make sure I'm saying this right. The total SDC for the single family plus ADU would not be smaller than a single family. It's just that the ADU itself would not be treated as a second single family. It would be treated as multifamily.
At a rate that's about half-ish.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So, Mr. Lewis, what did you want from us this evening? Do you want to go back to that slide again there, or the one previous to this discussion, or what would you like?
I guess what I'd like is some affirmation that the project list and keeping the project list is a good idea. That we maybe are headed in the right direction with this facility type for bike ped. That would be a good indicator for us as well. Those are probably two things that we need, right, Dana?
Okay.
Keeping in mind, the project list is not, other than unit prices, we've validated all that. This is very similar to what was in the TSP or in some of those plans that you've since adopted. So it's a solid list. It's so I don't see that being a big change. That's not the big change that we're looking for. It's just recognition that.
So keep the project list and keep the bike ped
Allocation
Okay.
closer. I mean, if I could hear some confirmation that you thought an approach that essentially took residential and more applied that to the residential or the single family residential, I guess it would apply to multifamily as well, but the residential element and break out less of that liability from the non-residential.
Okay. All right. Do we have a feeling here for Mr. Lewis to proceed with here? For myself anyway, I'd rather keep the project list, and I do think that we do keep the bike ped more into the residential area.
Okay.
Everybody else okay?
I want to confirm that the emphasis on bike ped and the incredible growth stated in there, that was a result of community input, citizen input?
Yeah, yes, we had, I remember the slide of all the, Laura was involved in that too, all the various community meetings and outreach meetings we had on the transportation system plan. A lot of those posters around the room, put your dot in the favorite project, and, you know, a lot of that kind of stuff. There was probably over 20, maybe over 30 project meetings. I don't quite remember back to 2013, but there was a lot.
Okay. You good, Fran?
Sure.
Okay.
One quick question. What would be the reasoning for not including all of these projects on the list? I mean, it just makes sense to me that if there was a particular project that had been identified, you know, whether or not money was there to do it or not, it should at least be added onto a list so that it doesn't fall through the cracks, or what would be the reasoning that we wouldn't want to include them? Because I can't think of one.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. It's better to have the list again so that there's opportunities to build that project. Because there's definitely, there's no projects on here that one could argue isn't a need. It may be a lower priority, but if you have a developer, for instance, who's, you know, building everything but that last, you know, 300 feet of sidewalk, it'd be nice to have the funding available to partner with them to get that done.
Okay. I think you have our feelings taken care of there, Mr. Lewis.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your efforts on that, and Dana and Doug. Thank you for coming tonight. We'll move on to item 3B, proposed park cemetery shop concepts. And this will be Mr. Phil Lewis.
Thank you, President Shaw and Commission. So today, staff is going to present park and cemetery shop concepts. As you recall, we presented to Commission in April a proposed concept for replacing one of our buildings in our park shops that is been red tagged and unusable since 2013. At that meeting, we received direction from Commission to move forward with looking at alternatives, including a property which is directly adjacent to the park shops and the Mountain View Cemetery. As you're aware, we did move forward with that, and we thank you very much for your consideration and support. What we're going to do today is, again, review very briefly the previous proposed concept, and then look at a couple of other concepts which would, given the direction of Commission at our last presentation of looking at, again, not only providing the shop for our current staff and workload, but also looking at a proposed 20 or 50-year plan and what a phased approach utilizing the resources that we have available to us moving forward in a reasonable and cost-effective way. So with that, I will turn it over to Denise Conrad, who will go through the specifics of the plan.
Good evening, Commission. So basically, we're looking at, on your slides here, our existing office, which you guys are familiar with. Most of you have toured, and we appreciate your time to do that. So just a refresher for the public as well as visual for you folks. So our existing shops, the red tag building is this one up here. That building is the one that's all boarded up and red tagged. And then our 50s style block restroom right here. And then this is the backside along the cemetery inside road of our office, just for orientation. This is our metal shop that they currently are using as the only shop that they have for any of their outside work and or storage of some of our equipment. Another shot of the restroom. The interior, so 1950s restroom, it's pretty abysmal, but it's also not able to be converted to an ADA facility. So it currently is not ADA. This is the concept that we presented to you back in the spring. So this is what would house our existing staff, which would be our 6 maintenance guys, and Ann Crandall, who does our building facilities maintenance, who is losing her office while, community services is updating the annex. Her office used to be in the annex, now she's in one of the open spaces at the PD. So she's using that space now, but we're looking to permanently house her. She has moved 3 times since she's been here 9 years. So we'd like to have a permanent housing situation for her, and this little office, this little office up here would house Anne in that space, and then she could do shared shop space with the guys. So this is our second iteration that gives us the half again, 1/3 again more space. Gives you a site configuration of our existing site. This gives you kind of a box image of space. And then this gives you a more of a 3D viewpoint. So this would be considered phase 1, which would give us the additional shop, office, lunchroom, locker space for the guys, and so our maintenance personnel. And this would be adding in our office, so converting our office space. Our current office space is about 1,800 square feet, and it's not usable 1,800 square feet. So this would be a much bigger usable space. So in the bottom, it shows you phase 1, phase 1 would be about 3,810 square feet roughly. The direct construction cost is about $1 million. And direct construction does not include your A&Es, your architect and engineer drawings, and that's a 20 to 30% of our direct construction costs. So phase 2 would be an additional 1,600 square feet roughly, and that direct construction cost being roughly about $500,000. So all in total, we'd be close to 1.5 million, and we'd be at 5,360 square feet roughly. And so that is considerably a little bit more than what would house our existing staff. That gives us a little bit of room for expansion in staffing and office space. So this is what we consider option B, just to lay out the box configuration of it and the parking lot. And then the 3D, which kind of gives you a little bit more of a visual concept. So we'd be moving this over into the newly purchased property, which gives us the option of utilizing all of our existing space while construction is happening. So again, a phase concept. This would be phase 1 at roughly 3,800 square feet and a direct construction cost of about $1 million. So this would be the phase 2 where we bring the office concept in as well as additional shop space. So we'd be bringing in another 6,800 square feet. The rough construction is about $2 million direct cost, and then total square footage is about 10,000 square feet with a direct cost of about $3 million. So again, the direct cost does not also include our construction drawings, so your architect and engineer pieces. That's a 20 to 30% cost of your direct construction.
What's the incremental gain on phase 2 in square feet? Phase 1 is 3,800 square feet. Phase 2 is the incremental gain above 3,800 is what?
Yes. So the phase 2 piece is the additional 6,800 square feet. And that would be the shop space and office together. So the second on here, this big square right here is the additional shop space right here. So this was phase 1, this section and this section. And the phase 2 would be the additional office and this piece.
So regardless of either plan, phase 2 in both instances involves demolition of the existing house that's there?
Correct.
Okay.
This would provide us an ADA accessible office space, much more usable office space, flexible office space, and then the shop. The other option, which wasn't presented by LRS, is that potentially we could break this into 3 phases. So the first phase being the office and shop, which is our most necessary piece. The second phase could be either the additional office space or the shop space, and that either one can be phase 2 or 3. So there is an option to phase this out in 3 phases versus 2.
What was the third phase again there?
The third phase would be either the shop or the office. It's a flip-flop,
Oh, okay,
whatever the
okay.
priority
Gotcha.
lays to be.
So what kind of timetable are you looking at for the phases? How much time to do phase 1? phase 2?
I think that is up for discussion at this point,
Okay.
because again, it's budgetary.
And did I understand correctly that if you were to do this phase, this scenario here, that you could still work in the other buildings while the construction was taking place? So you wouldn't have to demo them till the end?
The phasing, if we phase the office to the last part, that would affect the parking in that scenario as far as our site work. So, I mean, phasing in terms of making it the biggest bang for our buck would be definitely a discussion that we'd kind of get into. And we're at the 30,000 foot level here to phase. Right now, it's just, we're talking, there's 3 options to determine which phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. I think we'd have to get a little bit more into like the 15,000 foot level. So it just, at this point, it's an option. And the expense over time, if, as much as we wait over time, we're looking at a plus or minus 5% construction increase or decrease, more than likely increase. So each year has an incremental increase in construction costs in percentage over time.
Remind me, Denise, would this be a general fund project, or would this be eligible for SDCs, since my awareness of SDCs
I'm
has
going to
been
hand it to
heightened?
Phil.
Yeah, so as John explained in the SDCs for transportation, same goes for parks facilities. An expansion of services and providing services would make parts of the project SDC eligible, creating additional opportunities for providing services both at the site as a park for parking, or providing additional expansion space for equipment and staffing to provide the services at a system-wide level would provide some additional SDC eligibility. Part of it does also come down to kind of a policy and philosophical, investing in staff facilities versus facilities that I know some commissioners have expressed interest in, making sure that we put as much forward into the direct contact pieces with the community. The Mountain View Cemetery is a large facility within our system. Parking is very minimal. I could see that very easily being used as an SDC methodology piece. But most of the project funds that we currently have allocated in the current fiscal year is within the general fund supported non-SDC budget.
Thank you.
Moving into future budget seasons, it might be an opportunity to look at that percentage use.
Okay. So currently, we have a red tag building, and we do need to replace that, I think, as soon as possible. But then I see all of this, and I'm saying, well, wait, we'd have to stop that replacement now and take more time to get into dialing into these new designs and stuff. So I'm wondering if there's a way to keep going with the building we've already been considering, but still looking at phase 2 and 3 somehow. Because it doesn't look like the building we're talking about doing up there right now to replace the red tank building, it doesn't look like in these proposals that building is there now. We're now moving into the other land, and this is going to be more time consuming, and you folks won't have a building.
We're actually, the timeline doesn't change because we didn't do any architect and engineering drawings for the initial concept. These are all concepts. It's basically boxes that we can move around. The architect and engineer drawings to do this concept, these are fairly simple buildings with non-high-tech mechanicals, really. So as far as architect and engineering drawings, they're fairly simple and relatively easy to produce. Shop buildings don't take a lot. They're not structurally loading for 2 floors or anything like that. So I think as far as the drawings to get us to a construction phase, I think we're still looking at a relatively same timeline, whether we start with the initial concept or whether we start with the second or third concept.
My recollection on the original concept and my objection to it was constrained by other buildings on site that limited its size, and it constrained our ability to size it properly for the future. And with the acquisition of additional land, we can build what we call the 50-year response versus the 30.
Exactly.
So the question is, how do you step through that so as not to disrupt operations, and at the same time give the immediate, the first monies need to go where most needed, whether that be users, the ADA bathrooms, or whatever. I don't know, I still would actually want to review how much shop space do we need? What's the nature of the operations there? If it's just simply refitting existing equipment to do mowing versus spraying, that's one thing. And I don't know if you share any operationals with John's group down at Public Works as far as do you share maintenance duties? Or
Most
is
of ours-
everything done on site for you and on site for him as 2 separate entities?
Yes, we're separate entities, separate equipment for the most part. We do occasionally share some equipment, the bigger, heavier equipment, but primarily a lot of our equipment is to each our own. We do share some space at the Mountain View Reservoir site, and our understanding is that we probably won't have that space for very far in the future. So we're predicting that we are going to need additional shop space for storage, as well as if we have expansion, we like to house our equipment interiorly through the winter, which that gives us the advantage of keeping our equipment better for longer.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm kind of approaching this, first of all, it's a city park, right? And it's a cemetery that is, it's how old? 100-some years old. We draw a lot of the public into this, at very difficult times in their lives, and the facilities that you've been using all these years have worked. You've made them work, but I think it's high time that we do something really nice out there and make a real inviting atmosphere for folks that come in, and as well as when we have events out there, and so we have enough parking and enough gathering places for people. The restroom over there is essential for that public piece of it, of course. So I'm for going for the first, second, and third phase. What you have pretty much shown up here, as it works, and. I like the open space of it. I just like the look of it, the inviting atmosphere. As far as where all the money is coming from, I think that that's a discussion that I would like to hear more about. But I like the open space design.
My focus would be on right-sizing the facility. So if your studies show that's what you need for a growth curve over the next 50 years, then you stand by them. You're the staff and you put those things forward. But I don't, the general public, to use this common phrase, they don't want a Taj Mahal, they want a functional building, and they want it right size. So if you're gonna build it, make sure all those are considerations.
Could you walk through those just kind of quickly, because of our time frame here of the phases, or the projects again here?
And maybe the incremental gains in square footage and the associated dollars would be helpful.
So go back to what we call option A.
Yeah,
Yes.
So option A, this one in total square foot, new construction, 5,360 square feet roughly. So this is phase one of that, which gives you the shops and all the office space and the locker rooms. Retains the existing metal shop that we have. And then phase two,
so, just hang on a minute there, Denise, didn't, the first project we talked about didn't include this locker gear area, did it?
It
All we had
did.
was a rectangular building.
it was a rectangular building, so the configuration, again, for this option A is half again to a third again bigger than our original concept.
Okay,
So that's the difference. It gives us a little bit additional shop space, a little bit more room in the lunchroom and lockers. So we're considering having additional staff in these two A-B concepts the two additional concepts we're showing you tonight. It's for that additional staffing and space over a 20 to 50 year program time.
so what was our original dollar amount we were thinking about for this project?
The original hard construction cost was $442,500. And with the added cost of your A&Es, which, again, 20 to 30%.
And
So I
now,
think we roughed it out at like 650 in total with all considerations.
in phase one, you're talking about right now, that we're looking at is
It's
how
a
much?
million,
Is what?
1 million,
Is now $1 million.
yes.
But did we ever budget anything for this in our current budget?
Yeah, so
Yes.
the commission approved $650,000 in the current biennium budget to be used for the park shops project.
See, where I'm going at is I'm trying to get you a building here sooner than later, and you've already budgeted for that, and now we have to revisit this? So I don't know where we're at.
I'd like to hear their preference. I'd like to hear if you know, do you want a more spread out, utilizing some of the new property that was just purchased, having a more inviting area for the public? You know, it might take a little longer to get there, but, you know, into your space, but
As far
what's
as,
your preference?
as far as staff has looked at this and our considerations, our preference is option B because it does allow us a lot more usable space over a longer period of time. So whether our equipment needs change, whether our staffing changes, we're prepared. And that gives us every option to continue high productivity work in our areas.
Could you move to option B now here?
Absolutely. So again, this is option A, full 3D with everything, phase two.
It looks like there's fewer parking spots here in this one.
Smaller buildings, so requirements for parking spaces are smaller. So, yes, and because we were only looking at utilizing this property site and not the expanded
Yeah,
property
you're
at that
not
point.
into the new site? Okay.
Yeah. This is prior to having that option.
And are you still using that metal building, that outbuilding that's? is
Yes, so that metal outbuilding is still there. Again,
So that's the dark gray
The dark
building
gray
in the top,
building.
right?
And so that would stay
that
under,
would stay as part of our utilizing in our facilities. It doesn't limit our ability in the future to have another phase. Again, the way we looked at these and how I spoke with LRS was to have the option of potential phasing over time. So this one also has that option, especially with the property next to us. So this is,
But the cost on that was 1.4?
the cost on that was 1.5 roughly.
for
in
all
total,
three,
phase one
all
and
three
phase two.
phases, or two phases?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is option B, phase one. This is just over $1 million for the first phase. and that square footage is 3,800. Phase 2, 6,800 additional square feet at roughly 2 million. Total for phase 1, phase 2, roughly 3 million.
So twice.
And this is the one you prefer here?
This is the one we prefer. It gives us the option of, on the phasing, utilizing still our office space while the other offices are being built for phase 2. So we would have that option of still functioning efficiently while construction is occurring.
So do you anticipate 50 years out, or?
I think in 50 years, even though we're projecting this to be our 50-year plan, you know, equipment changes, bigger equipment, less man hours, if we have those options available to us, and it's all about funding. So I don't see us rapidly hiring to what our FTEs per acres would be in the next 20, 30 years. I don't think we'll ever meet that capacity. But we want to have the space configuration to take on additional staff. Is this going to take on a capacity level of FTEs to acres? Probably not, but we're not projecting we'll have that funding to do that. And we've always worked at a deficit. We kind of figure a growth pattern at that deficit rate, but having the ability to still have additional space and equipment space for our staff to highly and effectively work in their areas.
So the couple of key points that Denise pointed out. So the current Plan B that you're looking at would allow, again, staff to continue to work out of the current office space and then transition without renting modular units, without high impact to the families that are coming to mourn and bury their loved ones. Additionally, it would create, as you're looking at the left-hand side, kind of a, as you're coming into the main area of the facility, a nice open green space with the restrooms there to allow for that kind of transition into the rest of the cemetery property, with the facilities kind of tucked back a little bit more than you might see in the other renderings, which are a little bit closer to the main gates for the property. It also allows for kind of a delineation between staff and vehicular parking for service vehicles kind of on the back side versus the entry side of the property, which allows for users of the facility and kind of that day-to-day interface with the public. So it does give us a little bit more of a full use of the additional property next door compared to the more compact footprint of the other property. Again, we recognize that budget is always a concern, and you have many things that you need to juggle as far as providing services for the community. And you know, we obviously would like to have a little bit of the footprint that's shown in order to spread out just a little bit more and make better use of the site. But at the same time, we recognize that we have a shop that is not currently available for staff, that has been red tagged for 4 years, and that we need to move forward as quickly as possible. So the phased approach, whether it's with the option B or option A, will definitely be something that we want to move forward as soon as possible in order to provide those facilities as soon as we can for staff.
So under option B, would the house that's on the property we're purchasing remain, or would this use the entire site?
That would use the entire site, but the house would be able to remain through phase 1. Phase 2 would require demolition of the house in order to provide the additional parking space.
When we say the house, we're talking about the house that currently serves as an office?
I'm sorry.
Or the house on the property that was
The house on
acquired?
the newly acquired property that is currently being leased out.
So phase 2 looks like 2.9 plus the architectural work and everything like that, is that correct?
1 and 2 total is the 2.9
Right, and that's what you're
Plus.
looking at for the big picture here for
for
you.
big picture.
So we kind of know where parks falls in our budget usually. And I guess, and I think we're on agreement here, we want to make, and you guys have done your homework here, you know what you need. We're just kind of second guessing, you know, from up here, but you know exactly what you need. And if it's traditional with all the other departments in this city, we know how prudent it is that you folks have done this, you know, like we've done with the library, we're doing public works, that you guys are doing the best thing for the taxpayer here. So, keeping that in mind and knowing where parks come in our budget usually, are you willing to step out and stretch this thing out in these 3 phases, hoping that we're gonna have the funds available to do all this? Yeah, you might get phase 1, but is that gonna be okay for 5 years or what? I'm just trying to be a little bit, you know, I'm a card-carrying optimist,
Yeah.
okay?
I hear what he's saying. I mean, the question is, can you do this in phases, maintain continuous operation, service the public? So when you break it down, okay, we're gonna do this, and then, like that metal building, we've seen, there's no arguing about the red tag building, okay? That's just in the way. But the metal building, I don't see that as a long-term service option. So at some point, that's gotta go. But what do you need immediately? You know, who's your customers? What do you need to service them? What do you need to keep your equipment running and provide your staff with a safe working environment? If you've phased it in that, I'm prepared to, but again, you're the director. This is your department. You're responsible for outcomes. So you tell me what you need and I'll honor that, but be prepared to back it up and be prepared to answer to the public.
Yeah.
And I hear what you're saying, Brian.
And I would say that the current facilities for staff are inadequate. They don't have places to use the restroom, particularly during the winter time when the lines freeze. They don't have places to do the work that they need to do within a sheltered facility. They don't have appropriate areas for storage of chemicals. They don't have the appropriate storage facilities for storage of equipment to make sure that we maintain the longevity of that equipment. So it is a need. We recognize that there are many, many needs across the city, and we wouldn't be here if it weren't of concern to myself as a director and to the other staff that work within the department. So the budget as it sits is of concern, and it's of concern to me. We can replace like for like and move forward. That doesn't give us a lot of opportunity, as you stated, long term. If that would be the direction of the commission, we would support that and move forward the best that we can. The option B that we have proposed as a preferred option would allow us more flexibility, which would allow us to continue to provide service without interruption and without additional cost of temporary facilities, things like that as we move forward, and would allow additional capacity as the years go on. We do recognize that we might not get to a phase 2 or a phase 3 until many years down the road, and that would be obviously once we have the resources available to make those decisions and move forward. We would be very happy to move forward in that direction, but we do recognize that it's difficult to find money with competing resources.
I'm all for starting with the current state with provision for the future conditions. I'm hearing that, I looked at your comparables. I wouldn't even use the one as a comparable because I think their staff was about 3 times what yours was. Some other city was cited. So you're saying, do you anticipate a growth in staffing? Do you anticipate doubling or tripling your staffing over the next 20 years? Is there going to be an increase in land care or volume, or are we stabilized at whatever we've got for employees?
Well, I would say that we currently have equipment that we're storing in modular units off-site. We currently have equipment that's being stored at the reservoir facility that we have been led to believe we will not have access to. So we do have some even current conditions, a need which we're not serving. Moving forward, I would anticipate that we probably will continue to add facilities. We're looking at the Willamette Falls Legacy Project. We're looking at the Cove Project and adding some green space there. We're looking at Glen Oak Park, Filbert Run Park, all of the concept plan areas in South End and Park Place. We're continuing to see growth. And so as a community, we will continue to see a need for additional equipment, additional staff. All of that is prioritized at the commission level. So if you see fit to continue to add staff, we would be very happy to address the gap in service. But there will be a need to move forward in a growth at some point. And we want to be able to provide that service at an appropriate level moving forward.
Okay. Renata?
I guess I would go for option 2 and also encourage the phasing, and when the time is right, to do an assessment of what are the additional costs by waiting, because as you say, construction costs are going up. And so if you do it all at once, there may be some economies of scale, or the bulk of it at once, by constructing it and at a lower construction rate. So those are things to think about that, will impact the costs and will help us make a decision. Mm-hmm. But, you need, the space you have is inadequate now, and with the addition of this new property, it gives you the opportunity to really make an efficient use of the space and something that's good for the public. So that's why I would support it.
Thank you.
Okay. It sounds like we're kind of in favor of option 2. And I want to thank you for bringing this, kind of expediting this, our request to us here a little sooner. So, and we will continue to look at the budget as we go along, to maybe there's going to be room for more park revenue. So, okay, good. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to 17-536, murals and temporary signs for tourism. We get to listen to Liz Darwin tonight. We're spreading this around tonight.
Thank you very much. Lower Turbine Community Development Director, we're excited to be here to talk about signs. So we're here to talk about murals and temporary signs for tourism. Before we start, though, I just wanted to talk a little bit about big picture. Everybody remembers that we updated our sign code. It took a few years, actually, and it was adopted by the City Commission in May of 2015, and then it was effective in November of that same year, so there's a delay period. When we did that project, we had a project goal to create a signage code that was fair and reasonable and supported by the community. Sign codes can be challenging because there are many different types of signage needs, and to balance all of that was definitely a challenge. We put together a community advisory team and many hearings and open houses and websites and things like that to collect feedback from the public to give us the direction on the package that we have. There's some legal requirements, as there always are when community development talks. Specifically content neutrality. So we can never even have any discussion at all about sign code without saying content neutral, which means that in practice, we need to be able to regulate signs as if there's butcher paper over the wording. We need to be able to regulate the height of signs, the material of signs. We can regulate the placement or how many or what kind of signage options are available to the public, but we can't regulate what the sign says. So you can't read it and say someone submits a permit and it's like a picture of my face and you're like, I don't want to get a permit, we don't want to approve that. You can't do that. Or you get a permit application and it says Laura's Coffee Shop, and we had a regulation that says I can only put a sign in front of my coffee shop. Can't do that either, because you got to read the sign, see what it says, to see where it is in relationship to the building. So there are a lot of ways in which the content neutrality applies, but the easiest way to think about it is if you don't read the text at all. In the state of Oregon, we do not regulate content at all. There's a small case if there was some profanity or something, there's a court case about that. But in the most part, butcher paper over the signage, and that gets us where we need to be. We didn't update our sign code for 20 years or so. Nobody did, because it's so litigious. And so it was a really big win that we didn't even get appealed, let alone get sued, because I think there was this underlying assumption that that was going to happen. And that's a testament to all of the good comments that went into and the participation that went into this group, so that everybody's a little bit of invested into it. Maybe everybody didn't get exactly what they wanted, but the overall package was pretty good. So we had a lot of meetings, so the 40 meetings, lots of mailings, and you name it. We put together a document that guided us while we made code regulations, so where the community wanted to go on big picture items. So I want to go over real quick before we get to what we really want to talk about, what our sign code allows now. And the reason why I want to do that is because of this content neutrality thing. So if we want to talk about opportunities for signage for tourism, I want everyone to be clear on what the opportunities are right now. And so the signs are regulated by use, or zoning designation, actually, not use. And so we have zoning maps of the city. We look up what your zone is, and that tells us what your sign package can be. Essentially, you can get a variety of different types of signs. At the bottom of each of these slides, it'll talk about packages. So people can max out signage on their property, and so you can imagine a world where each property maxes out signage, and what does that look like? Or a world where maybe nobody does any signage, and what does that look like? And we can't really guess what the result will be. It'll probably be a mixed bag of some people loading up signage and others not so much. So when we went through this process, we kind of have to imagine worst case scenario, because it can be a reality. So for single family residential, you get one bigger sign and a couple of small signs, and you can put a sign in the right-of-way in front of your property. For multifamily, you get a little bit more than that. You get a big sign, smaller sign, the ancillary signs are 6 square feet, so those like A-frame kind of size, and then also the sign in the right-of-way. You'll notice the sign in the right-of-way in all of those. So together as a package, each property gets one of those. Conditional uses, so we're talking about churches, schools, and residential. They're a little bit different because they're unique to each property, so their signage standards are a little bit different too. Commercial is where you get the most variety of signage types. You can do lots of combinations of wall signs and freestanding signs and smaller freestanding signs that we call incidental freestanding signs, ancillary signs, which are again even smaller, and then some in the right-of-way too. We do have a code provision that if you have a lot of right-of-way, then you can get additional signs, or additional freestanding signs on your property, which is why you'll see so many of those at the bottom there. Then we also, in the right-of-way, not only do we allow those little A-frame types, we allow cross-street banners and signs on light posts. Sorry about the fuzzy pictures. But right now we have one location for cross-street banners. When we did our sign code, we actually had 2. One of those is a PGE location, which is no longer an option. And so we've been permitting all these sign types for some time now. Now I want to get to talk about signs for tourism. So the question, keeping the content neutrality in mind, is we could add more options for signage, but we can't say if you have a use permit for a party that you can have signs, because I would have to read the sign to know that it's associated with the party, right? We would have to say that all signs could have, maybe instead of 2 ancillary sandwich board type signs on that property, they get 3 or 4, or maybe that everybody on all properties can have a banner, or maybe only parks can have banners. And when we start to, the thing that we really want to be careful of is that we can enforce all these sign codes. You'll recall that it was an issue with the old sign code, the enforcement. Actually, I think we're doing a pretty good job about our enforcement these days, but there may be a couple of stragglers out there. But the point is, if we were to create a standard that says, say, you don't need a permit and you can have a banner for 30 days, it'd be really hard for us to know that. Like, how would we know when the 30 days started? We'd have to notice it, wait for 30 days to know that it's over the 30 days, and check in every day. So there's some regulations that we want to avoid just because we want to do a good job with enforcement. There was a concern that there weren't additional types for signs for tourism. I did speak with a few people in the public. It sounded like a lot of those came down to banners. Banners were a big discussion when we went through all the sign code. Most things with the sign code, right, you kind of see two camps, people that love it and people that don't like it, and mainly dealing with what kind of aesthetic, how do you balance aesthetics with the community, and options for people, for businesses, or whatever the things are. That's the ultimate balance in the sign code. It's how do we present ourselves as, what kind of city do we want to present to the public or to people driving through the city, and then how do we balance that with providing signage options? So when I've talked to some of the, anyone in the public that wants to do more signage, some things start to immediately come into my mind. One is, are you utilizing all the signage opportunities that you can? And we don't have, since we're content neutral, right? I could put a sign on a bunch of people's property with their permission, right? And it could have signage for whatever my business or event is. And there are a lot of opportunities for signs that don't need permits. All those little ones that were on the screen, they don't need permits. And so there are a lot of ways that you could do smaller signs throughout the city without permits. What you can't do, which is harder to do, are bigger signs throughout the city without permits, because once you hit a certain size, you need a permit. And then also once you hit a certain size, you only get a limited number of those signs. And normally if you're on these commercial cores, they already have them. So some discussion with the commission. After this, we can talk about murals, but what kind of feedback are you hearing from the public regarding signs for tourism? I can rattle off the top of my head. We've heard from the farmers market and from the Pioneer Festival, some of these bigger festivals and parks. We know that signs that are city-owned and maintained are exempt, but if they're not, they're not. So what are we hearing? Do we think that there's a problem? Are there solutions for these problems? That being said, we're always welcome to talk to any of our customers for anything, to identify solutions for them.
I've got a question based on the title of this presentation.
Yeah.
We're talking about signage for tourism. Is there a standard that qualifies a sign as being involved with tourist attraction versus normal commercial operations?
It's a great question, and the answer is no, and that's the crux of the problem, because we are content neutral. We can't say tourist signs get something that other people don't, and that's the problem. That's a great, because sometimes, like the Pioneer Festival used to have the banners out, so they can't have banners if nobody else can have banners, and this is sort of what led us to where we're at.
And you're familiar with, one of them was an example of the farmer's market there. That looked like a banner across the street. Was that cited as an allowable signage?
Mm-hmm. That is.
But that's not the banner that was in question, isn't the one up on the actual site?
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, code enforcement doing a good job. So that has ramifications for signs that were up that can no longer be up. We had a regulation that if you were up legally, if you took it down, you can't put it back. And that was the problem with the banner. So it was basically a banner on private property, and it was for the farmer's market. which again, we're throwing aside because we're content neutral. But so to our eyes, it was a banner on a private property that went up, and we don't allow banners on private property, except for in a small number of cases. You can get a permit for 30 days, twice a year, to put a banner on a flush of a building, but there's obviously no building where they put the banner, so.
It seems like one of the main drivers on the tourism front is for events that might happen on an annual basis. And with the farmer's market, it's weekly, but that's probably more the exception. And so as the tourism program gets underway, facilitating that, making that easier would be helpful to achieve that goal. And whether that's allowing event organizers to put banners on some of the street poles that have the ability to have banners on them might be a way to address that. And then if there is a way to identify another logical place that has a lot of vehicle traffic to go across the road to kind of highlight that a little bit more would also be helpful. So right now, I believe the only one that goes across the road is at Malala Avenue, about halfway up the hill.
Yeah.
But the previous one, I believe, was at the overpass by 99E, and that's a lot of people that see that and might think, oh, I need to go to this festival, or I need to go to the art fair or whatever. And so providing that opportunity would be helpful, as long as it's safe and it's not adding to the distracted driver problem. And I mean, there's things to consider about size, but in any case.
Do you want to talk about the new one? Cross-street banner location?
I'm going to add to that.
Is it out yet?
No.
I'd like to add to that.
Yeah.
Right. I think we struggle with, we've got one category, which is year-round commercial operations, and we understand that. And we've got another category that we understand clearly, apparently, which is events. You know, they occur, they're short-term, they're gone. And now we've got a third category, which is kind of seasonally operated businesses, and where do they fit into that mix, and how do we do it? And, you know, quite honestly, if a business owner operates a seasonal business and chooses to take down their sign to preserve it because it would be destroyed over the winter, and then that's viewed as taking the sign down, I question that, but maybe tonight's not the night. I mean, I, as a business owner, would want to be able to preserve my signage to use it during my normal operations. So those are my thoughts on signage in general.
Yeah, it's just balance of content neutrality, right?
So we are in the midst of accelerating our tourism portfolio here in Oregon City, and signage is usually a big factor of that. And I would imagine that's why you've brought this before us here, or one of the reasons. So I think Commissioner O'Donnell's right, is how do you identify tourism? You know, what is that? And maybe that's how, because somehow we have to have how do you differentiate between tourism and maybe not tourism? You know, because there's always going to be.
We never can.
Okay.
Yeah. But we can work with the tourism plan to come up with, you know, perhaps there are really good locations where the city can construct a sign frame, and then just like these cross-street banners. So again, we're looking at additional cross-street banner locations now, so we'll kind of continue to dig into that. But maybe the city wants to, as a part of tourism, construct some frame, and then you know, someone rents that for a month or something, and you're content neutral on who rents it or what that sign says, but it's an additional opportunity that could kind of maybe split the difference a little bit.
Yeah. Again, I feel normal commercial, continuous 12-month-a-year business operations are one category. Even within that, say the brewery wants to hold a special festival, and that's a different level of signage that comes under this tourism piece in my mind. And so that the commercial end, I think, is pretty straightforward. The special event end, I don't think that's overly demanding. That qualification, once again, is, well, I'm engaged in a tourist business as opposed to a normal commercial venture. I think we need that. That probably comes under time constraints and how long do you operate and placement, so.
Nancy?
Can you explain the requirements for a banner across the street again? I know you talked about
Yeah,
PGE
that was
poles, but, what, would it be possible for anyone to come in and erect two posts one on each side of the street with the proper permitting and everything, and then to regularly hold banners for all kinds of events in a couple different places in town?
So, no, someone can't just come along and put something in, you're talking about putting something in the right of way that would
A post of some
cross,
kind?
Other than someone like PGE, we could work with
Or
them
the
to do
city?
something like that. The city can do that, and in fact, we're considering doing that in a couple of locations in the future. We've got some hopefully unique ideas that the community would appreciate in terms of those, because we've lost, we used to have them on Clackamas River Bridge, 99E, there used to be a cross-street banner there. We put them on the pedestrian bridge that crosses 99E out by the bluff, and then Malala as well. And so we hope to incorporate a cross-street banner location in the Malala Avenue project, so that we'll have that opportunity. We've talked about doing one on Beaver Creek Road near the farmers market location. And those are our facilities. We manage them. We've got a banner policy that, again, talks about content neutral. So that's always been, when I first got here, that was a big frustration for me I wanted to manage content because I didn't want the wrong thing showing up there. But we still have that concern. But our policy, I think, addresses that appropriately. But we'd also, I'm a little leery of having to put up and take down a lot of banners. It's not necessarily a moneymaker for us, and so we're hoping to get a grant to help with the installation of that system. And then taking banners up and down, we like to regulate that, just like we do these banner arms on streetlight facilities. Those take time. They take somebody to get out there and put them up. But so we could do that, but we typically wouldn't expect, let's say the farmers market, for instance, or Main Street, or what do we call them, DACA, to propose, or they might propose wanting one, but necessarily be the ones to implement that facility. That'd be a city job.
So the mechanics for signs in the right-of-way is that you rent it for a month, and if you want to be on a streetlight post, you pick which post. We have the cities divided into 4 grids, and so you rent a grid for 30 days, and you can put as many on however many streetlight posts as you want in your grid. And then for cross-street banners, same thing. You rent it for a month, and they're first come, first serve. And there's a limitation, so you can't rent out a year out. But it's been working pretty well. There is risks, right, because of this content neutrality, which is why we didn't allow signs in the right-of-way before we did the sign code. The sign code opened it up to allow signs in the right-of-way. The risk is the sign could say something terrible, and the city's putting it up regardless of what it says. Anyone could apply for a sign permit to use the city's facilities in the right-of-way, and it'll be up there for 30 days no matter what. And so that was the risk. And because of that, we got into this discussion on murals.
Before you transition to that topic, I'm wondering if the rules are different if it was part of an ongoing tourism promotion campaign that the city, hotel tax, and other sources funded, and there was a list of approved events, and it's kind of a program. It's not a sign, it's a promotion. Does that make it different than a sign if it's managed by our very capable tourism staff?
I like where you guys are going. I love the creativity that's happening. So lawyers are always sort of hard to ask questions to. The answer is no. So it doesn't matter how far removed it is. If someone at some point is looking at the sign and saying, can we put it up, and reading it, then it's a problem. So even if it's that person at the tourism saying, is this a tourism sign, or is this, say, the right event date, or whatever, someone's going to have to screen it at some point, and that's the problem. It's just not at the permit counter, which makes it confusing. But yes, So in our minds, you want to be as clear and objective as possible. So it is, we get sign permits and we don't know what the content is. It just has a box.
But were you saying that maybe the city was doing it? Like the city staff had a program for tourism that had to deal with.
Just like you pay for an ad in a
and
magazine.
we own the sign. I
We
think
own
might
the
have more.
post, we own the sign,
We don't regulate ourselves.
Well, but it's still a problem because we don't regulate ourselves, so we're exempt from the sign code because we know the city has different uses for signs than, say, a business and things like that. And so, at some point, though, someone is looking at it to see if it's exempt. At some point, somebody is looking at it and placing it as an allowable use, but they're looking at the content to do it, even if it's our own sign. That is part, so it doesn't matter who places the sign. Somebody is looking at it and somebody is putting it in the right of way, and there could be a case where somebody submits it to tourism, a sign, and the tourism person says no, based on the content. So maybe someone wants to submit a sign that says, like, you know, come to my hot dog stand or whatever, and it's not necessarily related to some campaign that the tourism was doing for something else, and they say, no, that's not really within our scope. That would be a problem. And so, even though it wasn't direct, at some point in the scheme of the decision-making process, legally, you could find that it is an error, that it's not content neutral.
Okay, thank you.
So how did this work session come about? Were there a lot of complaints that came to your office that of folks who weren't able to put the right kind of signs, and they were confused by the sign code, or I'm just curious because I'm not finding any specific examples. I mean, even that people haven't really been coming to me. The only one that I heard from was the farmer's market. I mean,
I have been hearing from some. So yeah, good question. I should have started with the context. We did hear concerns from Pioneer Festival. We heard concerns from Farmers Market, and then concerns from various people associated with either of those two. And so there was a request to put it as a work session, and the commission approved a work session on signage. But the mural question and the signs for tourism question are sort of two separate that we kind of mushed together a little bit. Since you're talking signs.
Okay.
Yeah. So is the commission happy with the signage opportunities at the city, or do I need to give you more on this? Or is there feedback or results or some type of thing? Do you want to settle with the sign code a little bit longer and see what bounces up?
Well, I think we all knew that when we came up with this new sign code that it was going to get massaged, you know, like the old one did. You know, it started out as this thing, and then it got massaged, and all of a sudden these allowable uses and stuff happened, and it got out of control. But I think there's got to be something there, maybe even if it's for nonprofits or something like that, that can hold an event for, you know, over a weekend and be able to have banners out. And I was kind of the ones I'm speaking about, the Pioneer Family Festival, which is a community event. It's a nonprofit, and I was trying to figure out how we could get signage for that event. So that's one of the reasons this kind of came up, so. Okay.
was it also, you know, downtown Oregon City events that occur on a regular basis, and they're not able to put banners up, they're not, or A-frames, right? Just, you know, park here, or, you know, Brewfest, or, you know, something.
Yeah, well, that's
Yeah.
Well,
just,
I know that's content, but that's not what
Really
you're talking about,
events.
but I'm talking about A-frame, you know, just directional signs or something.
I can continue to work with Eric and with the tourism plan to see what kind of options we can do. we'll get creative and see what other cities are doing
I
perhaps.
just want to hear more from the public on it, I guess.
Yeah.
You know, I just haven't heard much.
Okay,
Okay, so
Thank you.
I'll continue that, and then the last thing is just murals. Murals, to me, a mural means a wall sign that doesn't meet our signage standards. It means a wall sign that's too big, because that's a content-neutral way to say mural. And when we adopted our code, we exempted some existing murals because we knew some murals were there that we wanted to keep. So what we did is we drove all around the city, and we identified all painted murals which exceed the wall size and limitations, and then we said they're exempt from the code, so they could stay, because if they were built illegally, painted illegally, then they would have had to have come down. So we exempted them. So I just want to acknowledge, when we're talking about murals, there are some that are up right now that can stay forever until they're removed, and some of those have been removed. We heard some concern about murals. A lot of the concern came from former Commissioner Rocky Smith about the mural code. When we did our sign code, we did come up with standards for murals that were in your packet. And this is this discussion of content neutrality and risk of the city. So basically, we set up a whole process for murals. It would have gone before an arts commission, which we could have named the Arts Commission in many ways, but it would be similar to a planning commission, or they would take on the role of Arts Commission, is what the thought process was at the time. And we would have standards for murals, and we would try and figure out a way to make standards so which the murals would not be advertisements, which was the concern. So some of those standards include that the mural had to remain for 5 years, and that you had to give the city an easement for the mural for the duration of the 5 years. You had to paint it with some anti-graffiti stuff, and you could not accept any compensation for that mural of any form, right? Because for advertisement, normally the beer company would pay the building person to put the painted mural on the side. And so we came up with these combination of different criteria to try and get allowed murals that would withstand the test of time. Mainly that 5-year duration thing was a big one. We pulled a lot of mural standards around, and actually most of them are not going to be legal at all. So that content neutrality thing is a problem for a lot of existing cities. Some of our biggest sources were Milwaukee and Portland for codes that did good things and had standards that would withstand the legal system. And so the request was to come back to City Commission and talk about the mural code and see if it was something that the commission was looking at reviving at some point. The background, again, is that balance between if you allow them, and it's going to be there for 5 years. So if it says, I hate Oregon City, or whatever the thing is, although nobody does, then it would be there for at least 5 years. So we have that code. It's more or less ready to go whenever the commission wants to move forward on it, if they choose to do that.
Have you had any requests for murals in the past couple years?
We get requests for businesses who want bigger signs.
But not painted murals on buildings?
Mm-mm. And so our mural code allowed painted, and then it also allowed if you want to do it out of tiles and that kind of stuff too.
Yeah.
But yeah, not really.
So most of your requests are of a commercial nature. I wasn't on the commission at that time. Was there any provision made, considering we want a theme in the downtown area and was there any provision made for historic murals?
Because of the content neutrality. That's what everybody wanted. So the goal of the commission at the time was to allow historic murals, because it did play into the small town character and the character of Oregon City. It was one of the things that people liked. And that was what they were wrestling with. We couldn't say the image could only be of X, Y, and Z, or you can't put limitations on the content at all in order to avoid a lawsuit.
Just as a side comment on that, at the Main Street Conference last week, the president of Main Street America gave a presentation, and in it, he said how he had been walking through Oregon City just to see what downtown was like, and he was tremendously impressed by all the murals. So I'm just making a statement.
You know, Estacada has a very proactive mural program, and it's a community thing, and the artists come together and they paint it, and it's not initiated by the businesses at all. It's kind of part of their heritage. So how do they get around the content neutrality? Is it because the city is paying for the mural and it's art versus a sign?
I would suspect that they wouldn't survive a lawsuit. I know Silverton's also known for their murals, and they also, so they delegated out to a mural committee, which isn't even the city. That's also a legal problem. But they still look at the contract to decide if the mural can happen, which is the content neutrality problem. So.
How does that affect private property rights? I mean, doesn't a property owner own their building, and can't they decide how they want to paint it?
No, a signage. They have to comply with our sign code.
So I guess the challenge is that you're interpreting a mural to be a sign.
Yeah, there you go.
We have a definition for sign. It's very specific. Like, I mean, if you want to paint your building pink or something, or purple or whatever, that's fine. It's just, we have a very specific definition of sign that's something that's trying to portray a message or image or sell something. And
Can you change your definition?
we can't. That was the hardest thing, is for everyone to agree on a definition, because, yeah, at some point you're just painting a building.
Historically, was there ever an objection to the mural that was on the old 505 Tavern that showed Oregon City history? Did you ever get objections to that?
It was already up, and so we didn't permit it. It was already there.
I'm just
Objections
asking,
to the
was
content?
anybody offended by it, or they didn't like the content, or?
Not that I'm aware of.
Nobody would communicate that to the permitting agency because it was so old. I mean, I think the thing with murals is that people wanted murals that were kept up and that weren't faded or peeling, and that was the other part of it.
That's understandable.
If it stays a long time, then you're more likely to have a mural that is maybe not an advertisement or something like that. But you also have to keep it in good shape. And, you know, our code said at 5 years that thing has to be gone unless you get approval again. And so.
So would it be worth contacting Estacada and Silverton and just see, maybe there's something there that they see that we don't, Laura?
We did.
Okay.
Yeah, not Estacada, but definitely Silverton and some
Okay.
other ones that had really good tourism murals. But I can dig into it when I continue to work with Eric on the tourism front about how murals relate to that. But
I
so
kinda
that
like
was
them,
the
you know?
risks, and that's
I like
why
them,
the city
yeah.
commission decided to not allow murals at the time.
Well, for what we're doing, there's tourism city now, you know? Okay.
So if it were, say, a city facility, like, say, a wall kind of near the falls or near the elevator or something like that, does that make it different?
Yes, city-owned and maintained signs are exempt. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Because like for cemetery or something, you would have different signs.
Directional.
And they're applied differently, right?
So if a city bought an easement on the
Parks
south-
would have like, you know, parks would say, here's a sign saying, here's this plant
know.
or something. That's just not, it doesn't apply well to commercial, right? They're sort of two different apples and oranges.
Okay.
So like footings for bridges, and, I mean, I could see lots of city-owned infrastructure that could be great canvases for murals if we wanted to be creative and wanted to go that direction.
Yeah, so then we just need to figure out how to get the content neutrality part of which murals to accept and how that part.
So we're back into the sign versus art circle.
I think it's
Yeah.
something we can talk about, because at some point, we print signs and put them in the public right away. We put stop signs, roadway signs, so at some point we look at content, so we can talk about that a little bit more.
Okay,
Thanks.
are we, okay, Ms. Darley? All right. Let's move on to something even more exciting.
Absolutely.
17-537, Police Facility Project Timeline Presentation. Chief Band, yes.
Yes. Good evening, Commission. My excitement for the passage of our bond measures being tempered by the workload that I seems to grow every day as I'm starting to swallow this. I want to just kind of give you a snapshot of kind of the plan, kind of the ideas of where we're going with a timeline. I'll tell you, as I'm learning things, the timeline I have on here has changed based on some conversations I had today, just really collecting a bunch of information. But I want to kind of give you a snapshot of what I think is the best thing for us to do, see if you're okay with that, and then start moving forward. So these, I've got 6 slides. I think we'll have we want to have a 6-minute conversation. There's a lot of money we're talking about, so I want to have a good conversation, but there's 6 slides, and they're going to cover these topics. So I'm just going to jump right in. Most projects that are done around here, we're going to talk about the CMGC process coming up, which is what the library did. There's one unique thing that I really want to do in this project that is different than the police. I don't think this has ever been done in an Oregon police department. Just about every city around here has been, I start going through the names of Kaiser, Woodburn, West Lynn, Canby. All those police departments have been replaced, and there's, the list is longer than that. The majority of them have all been done by one firm. It's a really good firm in Portland. But this is a lot of money, and we get one crack at this. And one of the concepts, I went to a conference, I think it was probably 4 years ago, and there was an architect talking there about projects. And one of the things he said that really stuck in my mind is he said, good design is expensive, and so is bad design. And that's just been in my head the whole time. And you know, there are examples of the Taj Mahal, as you mentioned, but there are also examples of colossal screwball mistakes that were made and missed that you're stuck with forever. And what is the expense of that? So my point in saying that is, I don't think that our approach is let's spend more money than anybody else on design. I want really good value in everything that we do in this police department. I'll give you just a couple little examples. What I want to do is hire an architect who will be an owner's rep who just works for us. Now, generally, the design in a project like this is about 8%. So instead of paying one firm 8%, what we would do is pay 2 firms 8%. So one of them would get 7%. That's your main architect who's going to be designing the building and doing the bulk of the work. The other 1% would go to our rep. I don't know if there's other people out there, but I've done a lot of research into one particular person that has piqued my interest in this. And I'll just give you 2 examples of why I really like this idea. I think when you've been living in a shoebox, anything that you go occupy looks pretty amazing. And I've seen that around here looking at different projects. But when you get beyond, wow, that's new and shiny and it's a lot better than our shoebox, what are you really left with, and what are the things that you're doing? Spent the last 4 years telling people in this community that this building is not a place. This building's a tool that is going to help us do our job. It is going to be an experience for people walking in, from ease of use when they walk in the front door and knowing where court is, knowing where code enforcement police is, to interview rooms that are going to be safe, quiet places, to separate entrances, all these things. And these are difficult to do, and I really think that we need to do them the right way. One of the buildings that I went into, I go into, it literally was a detective space, and there's a bunch of detective offices, and in the middle of the detective offices, there's a room about this big. And I said, why does this room have to be this big? This just seems like a bunch of wasted space to me. And architects will tell you about adjacencies and how much the standard is and all these sorts of things. And so if I'm talking to one person, I just kind of have one expert telling me something based on, you know, what everybody else thinks. And it's either my opinion or what they say. And I don't want to just accept everything that one person says at face value, especially when we start trying to hit our dollar mark. When we start value engineering and figuring out what we have to cut to hit our number, I want a really educated person helping us figure out the best way to cut costs. That takes me to the second point about what I think somebody specific to this, to building police buildings. Police buildings are very different than anything else. There are a lot of secure facilities that are not police departments. They run 24/7, 365. You've got prisoners in there. You've got courtrooms with their own unique set of safety. And I don't, about every police department, what I don't like about them is they look like fortresses. And nothing about the way that we try and run the police department in this community. I don't want it to look like a fortress. I want it to look very inviting but be very safe at the same time, and that is very doable. You just need really smart people doing it. One example of this individual that I met, I toured the Salt Lake City Police Department, $128 million police department. This person, all they do is police departments all over the country. And they do it in this capacity. Sometimes the architect themselves hire them to be their expert. And he was talking to us, he was in an evidence room. If you are at a crime scene, you've got a bloody shirt. It is evidence, it's very important. It's also a hazardous material, right? So we've got to make sure that our employees and the way that that's handled is safe and it doesn't destroy the evidence. So you've got these evidence lockers. They're very expensive. We only have one of them. Salt Lake has 5 or 6 of them. Well, where they were going, this architect knew that the HEPA filter that each one of these had to have replaced every year was $700 or $800. So he said, you know, you got 5 or 6 of these things, and you start adding that up, that's really expensive. I know this manufacturer, so he gets on the phone with them and starts arguing about if there's a way that they can ventilate to the atmosphere. Leads to a big, kind of a conflict, and ultimately he won. What I like about that person is he doesn't just know architecture and spaces. He knows police equipment, and he knows enough to think about little minute details like that, that if that guy didn't catch that, they'd have built that building and been spending $5,000 a year on these HEPA filters when there was a solution out there. I could go on about that person, but expert in police facilities, and the one firm around here that's a great firm who is probably got as good a shot of winning this as anybody. I don't want to speak poorly of them, but at best around here, if they built 8, 9, 10 police departments, they're working on some right now. If you've got somebody who's had their hand in 30 or 40, you know, I just don't want to underthink anything. I don't want a Taj Mahal. We don't want a BMW. We're shooting for a Honda Accord, something reliable that lasts a long time. The other benefit to this is if we don't use somebody like this, then we put out an RFP that says you have to have built a police department. And so if that's the case, we have a very small number of architects around here that have built a police department, which I'm not saying they're bad firms, but if you say in your RFP, instead of you need to be able to build a police department and demonstrate to us that you have, you get a pool. If you say, we already have an expert in police spaces, you don't need to worry about police spaces because this person's going to take care of that. You just need to be able to demonstrate that you built a building in the scope and size and, you know, that whole thing. Then instead of the people who've done police, you've got a much broader pool because they don't have to be an expert in police. All those spaces, there's going to be an expert already to help them with that, and I think it will be more competitive. And there might be some firms out there who are really good firms who do really good work, easy to work with, and it's not going to be that important whether or not they've done a police department before. And like I said, the cost is essentially the same. And another thing that they will do, we will have them help us with the process of picking our main architect, doing that whole RFP process. So you've got somebody who knows that language and everything about being an architect, helping us wade through architects, and somebody who's done a lot of projects. And that person is doing some work in Oregon now. Now, we will open it up, we will do a process, and there might be other people out there just as qualified that I'm not aware of. But I've at least, and the other thing I'll say, I've talked to a couple people in the state of Washington who have done the exact same model that we're talking about. Their projects are done, 10 years past being done, and if they said they had it to do over again, they do the same thing. So CMGC, the construction manager is basically the exact same process that was done in the library. And the whole idea, my brother's an architect and my dad's a contractor. Literally, my brother's an architect and my dad's a contractor. And there's this push-pull always between design and the reality of what it costs to build things. And the construction manager basically is in the middle of that whole process, and you're kind of designing and costing as you go. And if an architect is telling you that, hey, we need to do this one example I've seen is a really expensive roof that they were ceiling they were planning on doing in a courtroom, and you need a builder to say, we don't need, that's $150,000 to put that, so you've got this kind of push-pull going on between the two, and it's kind of coordinated by the construction manager and everybody else. But it worked really well with the library, and we plan to do the exact same thing. So design process, everybody has seen concept design, the concept design that we did. What you're seeing there is phase one, I think. The good thing about the site, the way that we've got it planned, is we're not just planning now, we're planning way into the future. Someday, this city will be building other civic buildings, a bigger city hall, and this site, the way we have it set up, I think we'll make sure this remains a priority. I think that would be smart, because it's 8.3 acres and more space than we need, so we need to plan the site with the future in mind. Public engagement be led by whoever our design team ends up being. We'll have a lot of open houses and invite the public in to kind of get their feedback on what they want. Not just about the building, the look of the building, the layout of the building, but also the site. When we first started talking about this project, I think some of you have heard me say before, I expected people to have an issue about the school, but what people really said is we don't want 8.3 acres of buildings. They appreciate some open space there. It's not a park, but it gets used a lot on weekends, and I really want that site to keep that. In fact, I want to emphasize that, and I want that space to be a place people can't help but come hang out by the police department. And generally, police departments are places you don't want to go to. It's not a good day, but I think we can change that by how we do this, and I think community input about all that is going to be a big deal. And then we also want to tell the history of that. Most people don't know that Mount Pleasant School, that is not the original school building. There's an older white schoolhouse that was built there, I think in 1865. And there's a plaque there that talks about that school. But we really want to talk about the history of that school, and because a lot of people in this community went there, and we want to make sure that gets told there too, and that's something we'll really rely on the public to help us with. And then obviously employee input, what's going to work for them, what they want to see, and I think that's obviously going to be a big part of this as well. So this is a rough timeline. I can't wait till 2019 to look back and see how, see how off this was. But we'll call this best intentions. If you start on the right, you can see our measure obviously passed. One of the first things that I want to do is get this owner's rep architect RFP completed, and then start on getting the building, the main architect, and the construction manager hired right away. One of the things that I have kind of learned recently is I think the building contractor RFP, I think we want to do that sooner than that. From the conversations I've been having, it's an even better idea to get them on board sooner when things like the price of steel and a bunch of other things start coming into play that they can maybe forecast. The public engagement process, I'm hoping to start in the spring of this next year, and that should take several months. And then our lease, the Merrillhurst School, as you know, is leasing the school up there, and that lease we extended recently out through June of 2019. It's much more favorable to us. It's bringing us about double the revenue we were getting before. And it kind of lines up really well for what we, hopefully we could break ground in July of 19. That's the target, having them out and then able to go to it right after that. We'll see what happens. Bond. So we, Tony, Wyatt, me, we met with, we had a phone conference with Carol Samuels, who's with, she's a bond specialist. She's been here before, from Piper Jaffray. And in a nutshell, the bond rates are really good right now. I think the index rate is under 3%. The last blip was right after the November election. There was a up because what's going on in the world, nobody knew. And things have come back down, and rates are in a really good place. She basically said that their economists don't think rates are going to go up in the next 6 months. But there's really, the best thing for us to do is to just start working on the bond right now, because we can get the bond, and when we have to spend, I think we're in a good place for all of that. I can tell you more of that if you're interested, but basically what I think is going to happen is you will probably see something mid-November coming before you, so we can get up and running on the bond and have that good rate locked in case something happens. Yes.
So you could lock in the bond, but you don't actually need to take out the money until you need it 2 years from now, correct? So we wouldn't be starting to pay interest or payments on it until we actually spend it. Is that correct?
There are some requirements for some of the money to be committed within the first 6 months. I think we're clarifying whether that means contractually committed or spent.
So like for an architect and some of these early expenses that you're talking about.
So she had, I think, so there were two things. There was an 85%, Wyatt could not be here. And I don't know, I wish Wyatt were here. What we do know is that inside of 3 years, you need to spend 85% of that money. I know that is not going to be a problem. They were cementing whether or not we had to spend this 5% inside of 6 months. I think that might not be the case. When we have to start paying back, I don't know. I know that we had a conversation. There was what did she call it? There's an analysis that they can do on basically what would it cost you if you locked the rate now and started paying versus you waited and rates went up by half a point or a quarter of a point or something like that. At the end of the conversation, what we understood was the smartest thing for us to do was to just move forward right now.
Issue the bonds and start paying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One of the things she mentioned, just for instance, she said that, like right now, she said Congress is looking at potentially lowering some tax rates. If that happens, they think it's likely that bond rates would go up. Is that gonna happen? You know, they're forecasting, we don't know. But I think at the end of the day, what we got from them is smart money is on just moving forward.
And can you be earning interest on that money to help offset the bond payments?
That is not a question for me. I'm tempted to throw some at you, but I think it's better. When we come before you in November, I'm very confident we'll have Carol here, Wyatt will be here, and I'm pretty confident. I will follow up with Wyatt and maybe have him shoot out an email kind of explaining in a way that a cop would not, something about bonds. So that's as much swinging at this ball as I think I should do.
And that bond rate will be fixed. I mean, it's not variable at all, is it?
Yes.
It's fixed.
It's fixed.
Some kind of, there's a couple good things. So the target is when you get a cost projection, they give you a range. And so the $20 million that we figured was in the middle of a range. That was right in the middle. It was 18 to 22, and so we just picked right in the middle. The kind of scary thing was we had them recost some stuff from 2 years prior from the first needs assessment that we did. And we were just having them do some street improvements. But there was a jump that was about 10%. And I said, well, what is this? I did not expect this because it certainly was not street improvements. And he said, well, that's a cost of construction that's gone up in the last 2 years, which is scary. But it looks like right now our target is really good. The other good things when we had kind of figured how this was, we thought that we would be collecting on CSAFE for about 2 years. And I think by the time we're going with the project, it's going to be closer to 3. So I think we're in a pretty good position. And we're going to hit our budget. And I really want to make sure that we can do everything that we can to get this thing paid early and get the fee stopped as soon as we can. Keeping that commitment to the community that's been so supportive of us. That's all I got. My only main question is, I think most of it's fairly pedestrian. It's the way that all these projects are done. The main difference is this architect. Is this difference in the architect. I've thought about this for a couple years and done a lot of research on it. I really think it's the right thing to do. It's more work for me, but I still think it's the right thing to do. And I think if there was any feedback, any questions, any general feedback about what you see or worried about coming up with the project, I really would be great for me to hear that now. And specifically, if you don't have any issues with the way that we want to do this thing with this owner's rep, then that is probably the next thing you'll see come before you we'll be doing an RFP for that.
Would the owner's rep also have construction background? So they'd be an architect, of course, but they would also understand the construction process and be able to provide good insight on the value engineering types of decisions to be made?
Yes, absolutely. Lots of experience. And experience of projects smaller than ours and of much greater scale than ours.
All right, Mr. O'Donnell, Commissioner O'Donnell, you got anything?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts about it. You know, I feel that most projects at time is lost on the front end during the design phase and initiation phase. I'm curious, I mean, I like having our own advocate both during the initial phase and on site to resolve any issues that come up during construction, but hopefully avoid them by being involved early. I'm a little apprehensive about people that have never done this type of facility, but you know, I'll stand by you. You said you've investigated it, but hopefully there's some, I like the idea of people that have been engaged in these before because they bring specific knowledge to those, which also could be a set of blinders too. So you know, I support the staff, and I always say you're responsible for the decisions you make. And I think it's going to be an interesting RFQ to the architect, because it's going to have to specify that you have to be willing to work with this individual and specify his powers so that they know what they're dealing with up front, because we don't want miscommunication. No, we didn't agree to that. So it'll have to be a very well-written RFQ that delineates respective powers and duties. I'm comfortable with it. Like I say, you're leading.
I feel it.
Yep.
Mr. Hyde?
No, I just, thanks for the update. I've been curious and wondering, what the next steps were, so that's helpful. Thanks.
So, having sat on the library building committee with Mo for a year or so there, it was, I can't speak highly enough of that process. You're adding one more element to it, but having that contractor and that architect and the owner and Public Works and everybody at that table every Tuesday morning, everything's ironed out, it just keeps going, and you come in on time and on budget. Now, adding the other architect, designer, architect, what'd you call him? I can't remember. Owner's rep. That's interesting, because I'm more comfortable now because it's going to cost the same. The main architect's only going to get 6%, and the other guy gets 1%.
7 and 1.
7 and 1, okay.
Ish.
I just think that's even one more step past the template we used for the library. And it's kind of nice because we're getting all this worked out. Well, Mr. Lewis here can take notes and how we're going to get through his. So, but I just think it's a great place to do it. And as Commissioner O'Donnell was saying, as long as the main architect can work together with the owner's rep, in fact, I think the main architect might really appreciate this, that all he's got to do is the building, and so I'm all for this, Chief. So I think it's a great concept, and anything we can do, let us know here, so.
There's a benefit to the architect. He'll have a single point of contact. He's not going to deal with multiple inputs. I am curious, when this presidential administration came in, they started about using domestic materials only. Has that impacted us at all, or that's never come to be? Are we specifying domestic materials only, or are we allowing sourcing anywhere?
That has not come up in any conversation that I've had. I haven't heard that. I talked to somebody at a construction company, one of the big ones who does these, yesterday, and that did not come up. And we did talk about steel. One of the things they said that there was a huge steel when the Beijing Olympics, the steel went through the roof because China was buying just tons of it, a bunch of our steel. So beyond that, I have not heard that. Yeah. It's a good question.
And that actually came up when we were doing the library. There was a void on steel, and just by having this conversation, knowing it was coming, it was only a week off because we knew about it coming in and mowing everybody and stuff. So we were able to stage everything else, that didn't require the steel, waiting for the steel. So it only managed to keep us a week off schedule by having all of these folks at the table at the same time like that, so.
I'm in the metals business, and sometimes if there's a possibility down the road of locking in a price on the steel, especially if we're concerned about the future price, I'd be all for it. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. All right, Mr. Manager?
I don't have any updates for tonight. Thank you.
Nothing there. Okay, well, I think we're squared away. Thanks for coming. Adjourned.
Nicely done, sir.